Hello, welcome back to the Star Trek Set Chat Pat Crack video series. I'm Mike Sember, joined by Johannes Klarhauser, Dan Milterhalter, and Tom Target, where we open up one of every of the 17 booster packs, Star Trek CCG 1E, and talk about the set. Today we're talking about Voyager. Came out on May 23rd, 2001. Consisted of 218 cards, 63 commons, 63 uncommon, 71 rares, another ultra rare, and also 20 cards unique to the starter decks. Can one of our experts tell me a little bit more about what's going on with Voyager?
So Voyager starter decks, and we're going to skip to starter decks first. The Voyager starter deck cards are 20 mostly reprint cards from earlier sets. They were a variety of things. There's equipment, there's a dilemma or two, there's some scattered other cards in there, but they're intended to make those starter decks much more playable for a new player. From a collector's perspective, they're kind of a nuisance because they are not equally produced or equally distributed in the pack, in the starters. You actually have to open quite a few starter decks in order to get the 20 card set. I think the last count was something like 10 or 11 starter decks to be likely to have filled your set. There's somewhere between 6 and 9 of them in any given starter deck. Johannes, you want to talk about the format?
Sure. So those starter decks are actually a big improvement over the original Premier starter decks. Those were just random assortments of cards, and you weren't actually guaranteed to have a playable deck. The Voyager starters were actually kind of semi-randomly assorted so that you were guaranteed to have a playable deck. I think it was only 40 cards, if I remember correctly then. And with those cards, you had everything to play in what they call the warp speed format, where you draw 2 cards and you can play 2 cards, and you play with a shortened space line of only 3 missions each. And that works really well with those Voyager starters. And it's actually something that to this day, we do quite a lot. One of my friends bought a huge stash of Voyager starters and also some Voyager and Borg boosters. And that's something that you can rip open very quickly late at night. You can assemble your deck very quickly, and even players who are relatively new to the game will get the hang of it very quickly. So they are a very good starting point that came quite late in the game's life.
And when it comes to these starter decks, I should say I've lost my voice for our audience, so I'm going to sound a bit scrapey, but I gained access to some new geek abilities. So see if you get this reference. I'll get you next time, Gadget. There we go. Some of you might recognize that. But when it comes to starter decks, as Dan said, not all starter cards are created equally. There's definitely some differentials in value, and it's almost exclusively with the equipment cards. So you want the engineering kit, the engineering tricorder, the medical kit, the medical pad, the science pad, and the highest value that I've seen is the Starfleet Type 2 phaser from the starter deck exclusives.
Johannes, but I guess anybody, you had mentioned, playing this warp speed format, and it's fun. How does the actual gameplay of Voyager compare to maybe prior sets?
Voyager was a complete shift in the game balance. First of all, it introduced a new quadrant, and unfortunately what it did was it made those factions that played in that quadrant, the Voyager Federation, the Vidians, the Kazon, it made them all very, very strong. So players tended to play with those new cards in the Delta Quadrant, and oftentimes when you played against people who were using Picard or Cisco, then you would have more or less a game of solitaire where you had separated space lines. One person is playing in the Delta Quadrant, the other person is playing in the Alpha Quadrant, and there wasn't a lot of interaction in that sense. So that's probably one mistake that Decipher had there. Yes, there were ways to interact. Yes, there were ways to play with those new Voyager cards, combining with those old cards, but they also, the Voyager set also served as a kind of new baseline, and players then played often exclusively with the Delta Quadrant affiliations and only sprinkled in a few of the powerful tools from before. So to give you an idea of some of the very powerful cards that came out, you have, first of all, very good dilemmas like the Hannonian land eel or the Cloud or Spatial Rift, and those were just brutal compared to earlier Premier or even Deep Space Nine dilemmas. And you also had cards that accelerated the pace of the game quite dramatically. You had Bazan Wormhole, you had Caretaker's Array, and those were cards that allowed you to get a lot of personnel and ships into play very quickly. And then this escalated quite quickly, and it was possible to have huge armadas in play early on. And it was possible to build dedicated battle decks that wipe out outposts very quickly before the opponent can do a lot. Something that is helped by the next set we are going to discuss. There are a lot of good tools like Handshake, an incident that is one of the best draw engines in the game. There is a card called Delta Quadrant Spatial Scission, which allows you to have additional copies of the Delta Quadrant personnel in play, and those are already very, very powerful. So they also happen to be rare cards quite a lot. So Decipher gave you an incentive to actually get more copies of those rare cards. Many decks, it was 3 copies of Janeway that you wanted, or 3 copies of Tom Paris, or 3 copies of all those good guys, sometimes even more. So it could get quite expensive to chase down all those cards. And in general, if we look at the personal selection, we'll find that the Delta Quadrant personnel are much more skill dense than earlier factions. And especially when you look at the Kazon and the Vidians, you'll see that there isn't a lot of source material. They don't have a lot of good shots of those different characters. So the few that they have tend to be skill monsters, even though they are only seen briefly on the show. So overall, Delta Quadrant is, in terms of power level, a good step above most of the other factions that we've seen in the game so far.
Our last few sets with DS9, I think someone called it kind of the golden age of the game. And Dan, you had mentioned it before we started that you kind of considered Voyager a soft reboot of the game. And I know, though, Johannes, you mentioned a few things too, like the powerful dilemmas, the skills monsters. But if you're comparing Voyager to the golden age of the game, like how is Voyager either kind of different from the golden age of the game, the tail end of the golden age of the game, or where does Voyager fall with that kind of concept of the golden age of the game, having been a few expansions before this?
Well, as far as the game mechanics are concerned, Voyager introduced simply a lot of stuff that accelerated the game pace quite a lot, and especially the fact that you could churn out so many ships and put them to good use. It wasn't the same play experience that you had before, where you had a rather steady flow of, you have to usually invest a card play or the equivalent of a card play into getting a ship out. And with these Voyager cards, you were able to get a lot more ships into play. If we look at the next expansion, then you will see this escalating even more. And that simply meant that you had the resources in play on turn 1 or turn 2 to attempt missions and even complete them. So that's absolutely possible. Whereas in the what most people refer to as the golden age, you still had a more steady flow of getting personnel out until you are ready to do a mission, maybe redshirting and assembling a big crew over a couple of turns, and Voyager jumpstarts this whole thing. There are cards like Home Away from Home, which is an excellent play engine. There are cards like the Vidian Sodality and Kazon Collective that give you free plays and that allow them to mix with different affiliations. So you can have the most powerful Vidians working together with the Voyager crew. So those all those things together meant that you were able to build decks that had very little need for personnel that only contribute 1 or 2 skills. So you have guys that have 4 or 5 skills, maybe a special download, or 6 skills, some of them doubles, and you were simply much better prepared to run into missions early on.
Even the commons that you see have 2 to 3 skills on them. even in Federation, but the Kazon and Vidian commons are completely berserk in terms of skills. Those would have been rares in early sets. In some ways, it feels like the soft reboot comment is real. It's saying, okay, let's start over. This is, you can go play this version of the game. It's a lot faster. It's a lot more aggressive. Yes, you can play it from the first starter. But if you're trying to merge it with your old cards, you may have just jumped the shark.
I agree. I think this is best seen as its own independent set. Play Federation Delta Quadrant only with Kazon Delta Quadrant and Vindian Delta Quadrant and the Borg Delta Quadrant coming up in the next expansion. It works well. You can treat it as its own separate entity. When you start to mix them, you really notice these imbalances and separate states that Johannes mentioned.
This set introduces one of the banes of the collector's existence, in my opinion. It introduces dual affiliation personnel that are printed in both colors. So Voyager was already following the trend of several of the last sets to have one ultra rare on the sheet and then 2 copies of rare plus cards and 3 copies of regular rare cards on the print sheet. And then it went ahead and made, I think it's something like 18 of those cards are total duals. So there's one Federation copy of 7 of 9 or Chakotay or Bolana and one non-aligned copy of the same characters on the same sheet, making them all equivalently rare to the ultra rare in the set to get the actual physical card that you're looking for. Yes, you could play with either color of 7 of 9 interchangeably, but as the collector, you wanted both versions, so it made half of this, or a good chunk of the already expensive rares into ultra rare rarity. It's why right now some of those cards are significantly more expensive than picking up a Pandari champion.
Yes, I believe Voyager was a double expansion in that, if you think of Premiere as a triple expansion, we've only seen a couple of doubles, such as DS9 and now Voyager. So when we're launching a whole new IP, we tended to see that. We still are plagued by the concept of Rare Plus, which, as most of our viewers will have known before, I'm not a fan of. I actually do prefer the concept of using multiple printings of dual affiliations, as we're seeing here, 2 Rare Pluses. I just wish they hadn't made them dual affiliation and Rare Plus. But one benefit of the dual affiliation system is that at least if you're a player, you don't need 2 copies of the card to use it, whereas if you're a collector, you do. So that helps a little bit. And second of all, as we've talked about before, there's often a large Federation bias in terms of high quality cards. And at least with the dual affiliation, typically non-aligned option, we have players from other factions who can use these skill monsters in a way that wasn't able to do so before. So I think there is a benefit with the dual affiliation model for allowing highly valuable cards like, say, Chakotay or Neelix to be playable by all factions and not just Federation.
All right, Johannes, what do we want? We want open from a gameplay perspective.
If I had to pick one, I'd probably go for 7 of 9, simply because she is so versatile. The fact that she has computer skill ×2 and no officer means you can download her to hand with Quark's isolinear rods, and then get her into play with Temporal Micro Wormhole, a card that is included in this Voyager expansion, and means you can play her in any deck, in any faction, in any quadrant. She has lots of good skills. She can do one of the Delta Quadrant missions on her own, and she also has the Borg subcommand icons that pair really well with Nanoprobe Resuscitation. I think that was also in the Voyager set, and that is a card that you can use as a play engine. You discard something using various means during your play phase, and then you play this Nanoprobe Resuscitation to directly report a personal from the discard pile into the game to where 7 of 9 is. So that's another card play that you can have in addition to your normal card play, to free plays that you might get from certain engines. So that already shows you that you can have, even if playing the regular rules and not the warp speed, that there are means to have 3 personnel into play every turn very reliably. And so that's a good example of something that plays very well with this escalating pace of the game. If I had to choose something else, I'd probably go for the Case on Warship, because it was such an iconic card that represented the sheer madness of ship battle that you could do with the Voyager and later on with the ball cards. Because if you're not familiar with that, the Case on Warship could be used to ferry other ships around. So the idea was that you report lots of ships, put them aboard the Case on Warship, get one way with a single wormhole to get the warship to where your opponent is, and then unload your entire armada that you brought along, and then just shot everything out of the stars.
And I picked the wrong day to lose my voice when it comes to the collector's perspective, because the list is huge. Okay, so obviously top of the list, you're going to want the ultra rare, which is the Pandari Champion. And let's not pretend that giving this card the skill geology because of being played by the Rock was not one of the best Easter eggs of this entire game. However, even though the Pandari Champion is the ultra rare, both of the 7 of 9 dual affiliations are actually the same value as that Pandari Champion, because of the fact that she's a skill monster and can be used by multiple factions because of the non-aligned component. Other dual affiliations, and there are a lot. We have Chakotay, who is fed non-aligned. We have Neelix, who is fed non-aligned. We have Seska, who is Cardassian Kazon. We have the USS Equinox, which is fed non-aligned. We have B'Elanna Torres, which is fed non-aligned. We have Kes, which is fed non-aligned. We have Lon Suda, who is fed non-aligned. One of my personal favorites, because played by the actor Brad Dourif, who was a favorite. We saw him in Dune as a Mentat Piter Devise, and in one of my favorite shows, Deadwood, as Doc Cochran. We have Rudolph Ransom, who is fed non-aligned. We have Tabor, which is a Federation Bajoran. We have Maxwell Burke, who is fed non-aligned. So there's quite a few dual affiliation personnel. There's still some high value single affiliation rares, such as the USS Voyager itself, Catherine Janeway, Tom Paris, which is the first card I'm aware of, maybe I'm wrong, but he has navigation ×3, which is, again, just an example of the skill bloat, but also something I'd never seen before. We have Tuvok, the Doctor, and Harry Kim. And like many of the sets we've seen before, the value of these single affiliation cards tends to scale with their rank. So Janeway is the highest value, being the captain, and Harry Kim is the lowest value, being the ensign. You also have the Delta Flyer, which is quite high value, along with the Barzan wormhole and some of the dilemmas that Johannes mentioned, such as Hanonian Landiel and the Swarm and things like that. Some of the uncommons actually have some value. So Caretaker's Array, Mutation, which is a draw engine. And here we also have some uncommon dual affiliation cards, such as Chell the Bolian, who is one of my favorites, because when it comes to a lot of these Star Trek series, I loved recurring characters who weren't major but appeared multiple times. So Chell appears first in the episode Learning Curve, again in the episode Repression, and then he's mentioned several times, including in the episode Endgame, where as a character he's going to replace Neelix as the ship's cook. We also have the dual affiliation Noah Lessing, Marla Gilmore. So here we have more uncommon dual affiliation cards. And the only other uncommon I like to see in this, the Mobile Emitter also has a little bit of value. Some of the commons even have some value. Nanoprobe Resuscitation, as Johannes mentioned. And we also have uncommon dual affiliation cards, such as Crewman Ayala, who appears in multiple episodes. And the actor who plays Crewman Ayala also appears as the actor who plays Satan's robot, who we're going to see in the Holodeck Adventure set. Then we have the dual affiliation common Thompson card and Mariah Henley. So a lot of dual affiliation making the cut here. So let's see what we get.
Tom, one question before we get started. Now Dan's is coming back too, and don't want him to miss the pack opening. The ultra rare Pandari champion. I think this is the first non-Federation ultra rare, if I'm not mistaken, that Star Trek has. And you mentioned the 7 of 9 being about equal. Is Pandari champion kind of like a bomb card, like Dr. McCoy, who had to be errated because he was so powerful? Where does Pandari champion, and maybe this is a gameplay question, but just fit into the culture of ultra as being super powerful? How powerful is Pandari champion?
It's more that he has a unique ability, which is that we're now talking about a phase in the game where combat personnel is a little different. So in the combat personnel changes throughout the series of the game, in the early days, you were often looking at rounding up all strengths and seeing which strength set was higher between two groups and losing just one person. As the game progresses, we transition into a stage where opponents pair up for battle, and so you can have greater losses in that modality. But the Pandari champion's special ability is to select who he pairs up with and basically just win. So he's not really a skill monster. He does have good strength, but that's that one ability. So if you're not having a combat heavy game, personnel combat heavy game, then his ability is not that exaggerated.
All right, let's see what we've got. I think, Dan, this was one of the reprints.
Yes, this one's reprinted out of Blaze of Glory, right? No, First Contact.
First Contact. Yeah.
Okay. There's your shell, Tom.
All right.
And the Federation affiliation one, which I think works well. The blue with the blue skin is good.
Yep.
So again, and let's just clarify here too, the dual affiliation. So the opposite shell would be yellow, and also would have a little asterisk down here, right? Meaning that was the alternate
Correct.
version.
And the positions of the icons in the top left would be swapped.
Right, so those would be the three differences: the main color, the icons, and then okay. So those
It would have been a great Easter egg to give Chell barbering as a skill. I thought that would have been really nice.
Uncommon mission.
And a very good one.
Uh-huh.
So the Voyager missions tend to be more difficult compared to some of the Premier missions. However, there are also some missions that specifically call out a single personnel that can single-handedly solve them. And as we've said, since the Delta Quadrant personnel are much more skill-heavy, those difficult missions don't matter too much, actually. And 35 points here is good money. And the fact that this is a nebula can also be important for certain cards here.
Pretty mission.
Uh-huh.
All right, I think the next one is our rare. So let's do this little game again, I guess we're hoping for a 7 of 9 or a
Blue is good still.
Pandari champion.
Blue is good, yellow is good.
Oh, a mission. Uh-oh. There are rare missions in this set. You all didn't tell me this.
A couple.
And we have one. Very pretty. Again, can't really tell the difference except with the box. Yeah, we have a rare mission. Yay.
And as you can see, this one calls out Bellana Torres as an alternative to Engineer ×3. But I think Torres already has 2 Engineer on her own, maybe only 1, but still, so she can help there. And 45 points, that's just brutal.
That would be nice if Bellana and Tom Paris could team up, but apparently they can't because they need cunning over 40. So almost you could have 2 folks do this mission with that navigation ×3, as Tom mentioned. Okay.
Yep.
Rare mission. It's been a while since we've had a rare mission. I think about an alternate universe. You had maybe the warp space.
Yeah, I think this is Decipher learned a lesson in terms of reducing rare missions in the early sets. They almost completely abandoned them in the golden age of the game. But because this is a double expansion and they need a lot more missions for the Delta Quadrant space line, I think it was an unfortunate decision to reintroduce them here.
I think there are only 4 or 5, if I'm right. They did keep it relatively small, and they are, like this one, very high point missions or have additional game effects. Temporal micro wormhole.
So that's a staple card. It more or less replaces alternate universe door in a number of decks. Because you can now report personal. You cannot report any alternate universe cards with this one, but personal are fine. And the card is versatile in that you can download Space-Time Portal, which then gives you the ability to play different alternate universe cards and bounce the ship back to hand. Or it downloads Dr. Telegramor. We have seen him as a preview, and he's regularly included in this set. And that's also a great card to include in various decks. And even if you don't download Dr. Telegramor, you can use this card to report personnel of any affiliation of any quadrant to a ship and have them interact and mix with your guys. So that's something that is, to this day, often used to bring in this one odd personnel that you need for a particular special ability. And that enables a lot of very interesting deck types. So that's one of my favorite cards in the game.
So there's one of our common skill monster Vidians. Astrophysics, stellar cartography, and biology would be a pretty good rare in Premier.
This is an interesting card. We mentioned the Kazon affiliation. One of the interesting things about the Kazon is that they don't have transporters. So they actually have to land on planets and then have personnel walk out. And with this card here, you can actually give their facilities transporters, and you are a bit more flexible.
Yeah, I thought one of the other cards in this set, I believe, is uncommon, is Jabin, the first Kazon they meet in the Delta Quadrant. And I thought it would have been a really nice thing if they'd introduced an equipment card, which was just water, because obviously here we have an example of Kazon not having transporters. And we also had these sort of strange technological differences cropping up there.
Containment Field is an interesting ref card. You see that it punishes players who use certain abilities that are very powerful, like the special download icon or the hidden fighter interrupt or going to the top that can download personnel. And each time you do this, you have to stack one card from your hand there. So if you try to pull it off more than 2 times in a turn, then you forfeit your next turn. So that's quite a severe punishment. There are situations in the game where actually giving your opponent an extra turn might work out better for you. So there is a strategic element. And it also calls out a number of other cards. On the bottom there, it nullifies Destroy Radioactive Garbage Scour, and the owner loses points. It nullifies Static Warp Bubble and the Alien Kidnapper. So all cards that turned out to be quite dangerous for the game. And with Decipher's policy of not wanting to ban anything, this is the way of dealing it. We just print a card that says, no, you can't play those cards anymore, which can be equally frustrating. This is a card that works nicely with the Kazon warship. If you look at this Kazon Raider here, you'll notice it has the same range as the USS Enterprise and weapons and shields of 7. That is quite a good ship. It only requires a single personnel to staff. So if you play a couple of those, put them on a Kazon warship, then you have your mobile armada. That's what I was talking about before.
None of the Kazon ships have really high sale value, but they all do sell, even these uncommons and commons. You're not going to get much for them, but people do order them, especially as I assume, because as Johannes mentioned, they're building some kind of warship deck to use with them.
And no transporters means that you can't beam to and down a planet to complete a mission on the ship. Is that you need one of these shuttles to get down? How does that work?
That's right. So if you're aboard the ship, like personnel, you can ferry this ship around with your warship, and then personnel can just walk onto that radar while it's aboard the warship, and then you can launch it and you can fly around, but you'd need a card that allows this ship to land on a planet. It says here it may be carried, or shuttlecraft may be carried aboard this ship. So it's like the Russian dolls that you put shuttlecraft inside this, you put the radar inside the warship and so on. But you need a card like Blue Alert or established landing protocols for other ships that specifically gives you the ability to land, or some other ships also have this game text in their special abilities box.
There's another oldie and a goodie.
Yep, there's your reprint assigned mission specialists, which is a unique card to have chosen to put in there, given how few mission specialists there are in DS9 or in Voyager Forward. And your basic Federation Intrepid.
I think this one highlights how overpowered, in the lore sense, many of the Kazon and Vidian ships are, in that Voyager frequently beats off multiple attacks from multiple Kazon ships, and yet their stats in the game aren't that different.
Back to Ready Room Door. All right. Well, what do you all think of this pack? I know we had the rare mission. We could have one dual affiliation that kind of like was a little bit redemptive, that we had one to look at.
I think it was
here.
great, except for the rare, which was awful.
That's fair.
I think for the deck that we're going to build with the cards we're pulling here, the Temporal Micro Wormhole gives us a little bit of wiggle room to actually do stuff.
That's true.
This is one of those sets where, as much as I tried to get this straight from pack and straight from starter deck, just the sheer number of dual affiliation cards made that almost impossible. And I had some good pulls. I pulled the Federation 7 of 9. I pulled lots of the dual affiliations, but there are just so many that unless you want to buy, because normally you can complete a double expansion set with, if there weren't dual affiliations, and maybe 4, 5, 6 boxes. But here, just like you'd need 10 or 11 starter decks, if you wanted all the starter cards, you'd probably need 10 or 11 boxes to get all the dual affiliations, or you'd have a good chance at doing so. So I tried, but I have limits.
I absolutely agree. This is one of those where and you almost had to try and buy it as a case, so that you got boxes that were surrounded by the other boxes that were produced around the same time to even have a chance. But depending on where the sheet break was within the case, you're still probably screwed.
I think this might be the expansion that by now I've opened the most packs of between starters and boosters, probably more than Alternate Universe or White Border Premiere, simply because we often use this format, this Voyager Warp Speed, as a kind of late night event to introduce new players. And at some point we had so many of these packs that I noticed people weren't bothering anymore with taking home the Voyager rares even. So when I looked through the pile of cards that we would then use as backing cards, I noticed most of the rares were still in there, because nobody needs 3 copies of Samantha Wildman in my playgroup, of course. And that's one of the cards that I remember last time we played. I think I had 2 copies of her in my product, and one of the other players also had a Samantha Wildman. So no 7 of 9 to be seen, but we had 3 of her.
Yeah, the introduction of the dual affiliation really makes the non-rare plus rares much lower value relative to the set as a whole. So when you pull your 15th Marge color, you're just really unhappy at seeing, sort of non-Federation affiliation or non-dual affiliation cards. It's still fun to open, but it can be tough. Also, market-wise, there still is a very good market for sealed DS9 and sealed Voyager starter decks, both for the starter cards, but also just because of the possibility of pulling rares as well.
You mentioned the dual affiliate. Well, we talked a lot about the dual affiliations. What's interesting to me is kind of in the Facebook group and people looking for cards. And you didn't really know what cards were in the set, I saw a lot of people asking for those dual affiliations, and later I learned a lot of them are looking for commons and uncommon dual affiliations. It makes sense you need 2 of each copy, but it just, I'm looking through this pack, and even people looking for the common uncommon dual affiliations, makes it seem like these cards are pretty in demand, and getting those dual affiliations doesn't matter what rarity they are, they're certainly in demand.
And that's a trend we're going to see in the next 2 expansions as well.
Yep. Random anecdote: the common and uncommons, I believe, are both on the sheet twice. So theoretically, they're equal in quantity, but they're again half as rare as the rest of those rare commons and uncommons.
Well, I know you mentioned this theme will continue. We'll move on to the Borg, which I think is again a pretty. I think it's all Voyager, right? That's the show for our next next expansion as well. We'll move on to the Borg and continue the conversation there.